Hey folks, Steve here with another Fatal Alliances video. In this video we continue our end of turn phases of our turn 1 playthrough video series. Last video we covered some of the partisans and the reorganization and a few minor things like that. And in this video we're going to start our look at morale and production. We're going to cover a couple of corrections I want to make from previous videos, like I always seem to have one or two minor things. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a pre-morale calculation or a before production morale calculation, which is not really listed in the rules as the order of operations, but you can still do it. And I recommend that you do that so that you have a better idea of what decisions you'll make in the production phase. Then we'll actually do some of the production phase, all up to actually choosing what units to build. I'm going to save that for another video as sort of part 2, where we will actually purchase the units, and then we will apply morale effects, and then maybe get into some of the other topics. So, real quick, someone had commented on the social media that there was a mistake made with the Serbian HQ here that, and it was correct in the combat charts. If you check the back of the imprint rulebook, there is a note that HQ units can absorb a 0.5 loss if that's the only loss sort of remaining to take. And so there was a 1.5 loss here. A core was destroyed, and then there was a 0.5 left, and I destroyed the HQ unit because of that. But really, that HQ unit could have absorbed the loss, but it would still suffer any retreat or shatter result that occurred. It was shattered, and I've now placed that unit here on the production circle to come in next turn as reinforcement. So when a unit gets shattered, it goes on the production circle, it will come back, and you don't lose morale for the production points lost. So a little bit of a good thing for the Russians. Doesn't really inconvenience the Austrians too much. They're going to keep pushing into the country and hopefully take out the Serbians. The other little correction I want to make, and it's so that I can properly demonstrate some things, is when I returned the Commonwealth fleet to Scapa Flow, I'm going to leave. I will have left one ship behind, which then would have slid down from box 2 to box 1 at the end of the reorganization phase, or the end of the return to base phase. And it's so that the Commonwealth ship here can seize the American trade going to Germany. You need to have in the production phase a naval unit here with the convoys from the United States to seize that trade and cause a morale penalty to the Germans. Okay, so let's get into the actual morale calculation. In the game charts, there is a slide there that covers, how do you lose morale? How do you gain morale? The only way to gain morale in this game is to spend production on the home front and have that home front production sort of outweigh the losses that you're taking. So it's not going to happen very often that you can manage that, but the losses are plentiful in this game. As you can imagine, World War I was a war that was decided ultimately by morale, not by territorial conquering, and so it's a really huge part of the game. I've sort of talked about it in other videos. It is sort of the balance point that the game hinges on, rather than, I think, regular World in Flames, which is basically just a total war contest. This is really kind of important to balance your economy, balance, how you're dealing with the enemy, and, being too aggressive may cause too many losses, really hurting your morale, and there's a lot of sort of variables tied up in that. So this is a really interesting part of the game. If you look at that chart, you're going to see that there are a number of things that can bring losses for morale. So you have losses, the build cost of land units, first cycle of naval units, enemy controlling cities and capitals, strategic bombing, which we did not do in this series so far, but I'll probably make a separate video for, could do it. Losing an ace, which we don't have any right now, and then there's a few of these sort of more nebulous things that aren't tied to hard objectives. So if the Central Powers were to control the North Sea or the English Channel by the production phase or by the morale phase, then that would be a morale hit for the Commonwealth. Getting no American trade would be a morale penalty to Germany or the Commonwealth. And in this case, because of that ship here and that the seizure of trade is going to occur at the beginning of the production phase, that's going to hurt Germany. But as long as the Commonwealth is either getting trade or uh, resources from the United States at some point in the future, or Canada, then they're in good shape. So it's really hard for the Commonwealth to actually get that morale loss. They will have had a hard time over here in these Western Ocean areas, getting convoys destroyed and everything else. And then there's some for partisans, and we do have a few partisans out on the board, so that's going to impact morale. And then if a major power launched no land attacks this turn, that's also a pretty hefty penalty. So what I've done is, I've taken the graveyards, which were all over here and in various places. I gallered up those counters. I put them over here in the Western Oceans for ease of tracking, and I've thrown in a few placeholder counters just to denote all the different things that are impacting morale for the individual countries, so we can actually do a proper calculation. And again, the reason why we're doing this now, as opposed to the way the sequence of play would tell you to do it, is because we want to have an idea. There's nothing stopping us from calculating this now because we know what's going to be coming. We can kind of draw up the numbers, and then that will help help the powers decide how many of their precious build points will they spend on that home front, which most of the time is going to be the maximum available, but we'll get to that. So let's just go through the list, and I have all of this sort of pre-calculated. I did a lot of work before recording so that this flows pretty well. So let's see. These top two rows are Germany. So we have that Cav division that I talked about in a previous video that I kind of had to recycle the counter for, because again, all of these units should technically now be in the force pools here. I have them out for tracking purposes. When I'm done with this, I'll place them back in. Between this video and probably the next video, I'll put them back in the force pools. But 2 there. 2 for the first cycle of this naval unit, the Kaiser and Kaiserin. So 2 there. 1, 3 for this Cav Corps. 2, 2, 3, 1, 3, 3, 3, 2, and then there's that no American trade. That's the penalty. And all of that together, I've got some notes here, was basically minus 129. And I'm counting them in terms of negative. These are going to be penalties to our morale. So 29, which is pretty significant. Yeah, that's pretty significant. In fact, that's some of the worst out of all the powers that we're calculating here. Here's a preview of what we're going to be talking about. 29 is quite a bit, and if we were to compare this to the morale chart, what this really means is it's not 29 spots on this chart. What it is it's for every 10 you shift down 1. And then any remainder in the ones place you would roll. So right now, in a vacuum, if this was 29, German morale, as soon as I can find it, here it is. If we did nothing else, it would be 1, 2, and then we'd roll a die. And if it was 9 or less, which 90% chance, it would drop down again, which is pretty devastating. But there's going to be some things Germany can do to deal with that, with the home front production. That no American trade is going to be happening every turn until the Central Powers can break the blockade, so to speak. If they can get the North Sea free of enemy units. But sort of the reality is, once the United States player has shut off all of the trade, which they're starting to do, right? They start with sending 3 resources to Germany as the United States takes its entry options. It can reduce that eventually to 0. And once it goes to 0, this is basically going to be happening every turn. So this is going to be something that is really going to hurt Germany like it historically did. The blockade was a huge impact to the Central Powers, and that's reflected in the game. At least this is one component of how that impacts the game. So that's pretty rough. And it's funny. You'd think oh, Austria-Hungary is more fragile, and it is. It's just Germany has done all the heavy lifting, but sort of equally, Germany has a better economy and has better production that they can account for dealing with the morale losses better than Austria-Hungary would. Here, Austria-Hungary has really only lost 1 unit, which was this corps, but the Russians have taken Cernati. I don't know how to pronounce that, so bear with me. Cernati or Kernati, the Carpathian resource that is right off the mountain hexes. They lost Lemberg, the city, and they have the Partisan, which is not in their territory, but it is in Belgrade, which they control. If you look at the morale charts, number 8, partisan and territory, it doesn't specify what that really means in terms of territory, because you could try to infer that in meaning it's a territory, meaning a place on the map that is a minor country with no capital, or it's just, I don't know, broadly a territory. I've sort of always interpreted it as just having a partisan in a hex that they control. So we'll go with that. Maybe somebody can correct me down the line in terms of how that is really done. I mean, obviously, if you have a partisan that's your enemy in your home country causing problems because you got a red result, that's one thing. But I've chosen just to count it. So Austria-Hungary has 7, which isn't very much. They've actually done okay because they've been on the defense, really just kind of losing some ground to the Russians, but otherwise mopping up the Serbians. So that's pretty good for them. Then we have the Russians. So they've lost a couple corps. They lost an engineer division that actually is worth quite a lot of production for what you're getting. You're getting cool abilities with the engineer, but they are expensive. They did lose a ship in the Baltic, and then you have the majority of the Serbian armed forces here that have been destroyed. Now they're a little bit cheaper. They have a separate force pool for that reason. But they do count against the Russian morale because as a major power, minor country units that are destroyed count for morale losses. So it's sort of as guardian of the Slavs, the Russians are going to be sort of getting embarrassed by the fact that their allies getting chewed up and they're not doing enough to help them. They're falling apart. Because Belgrade, a minor capital, is controlled by the enemy, that means it's another loss of morale for the Russians every turn that this is occurring. This will be, all these things that are, cities and resources taken from home countries and minor capitals, that's going to be applied every turn. So, over time, it's just, it's going to be painful. So they got that, and then there is the partisan that's in Poland that, again, because I'm counting the partisan for the Belgrade Serbian partisan, I'm going to count the Polish partisan here. And sorry, I'm like yawning and I'm trying to do it quietly and go on mute when I do it, but I'm just kind of tired today. So they're at a minus 27, which is almost as bad as Germany, and most of that being because of Serbia, really. The Russians are trying to push on the Germans on the Eastern Front, but they're just kind of losing things elsewhere. And the troubling thing is Russia needs to hold off morale loss as much as possible because pretty much everything in the game puts a pressure on them to lose morale and leave the game. So that's going to be a thing to watch. And then we have an absolutely incredible loss number for Commonwealth, minus 31. That's the worst right now, and part of what makes that so much worse is that there's a special rule that comes to do with British land units. Notice that it's British, not all Commonwealth. Particularly British land units cost 1 extra morale per unit. And so this HQ, that's worth not just 5, but 6 morale points of loss. This is 4 instead of 3. And technically, all the divisions are considered British. That is 4 as well. So just by itself, these first 3 units, because the HQ is worth so much, 6, 10, 14, 16, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 25, 6, 7, 31. So, we've got the land units. That extra morale per unit doesn't apply to naval units, so these are just at value, though this is still a fair number of naval units that were lost in that clash that occurred. They did lose the airplanes to overrun, and then, what's kind of challenging is that North Rhodesia and Rhodesia, if we look on the world map here, North Rhodesia has a capital, as does Rhodesia. So by having capitals, the minor capitals occupied by the enemy control of the minor country capital, that is going to be a point each per turn, going through until they can be, essentially liberated and what have you. So that's going to be a problem going forward. And the other critical thing that really hurts the Commonwealth is that they never really got to do a land attack. France was almost in that same state, but they launched an attack very late in the turn. But because the British Expeditionary Force basically got crushed out of the gate, the Commonwealth didn't really have anywhere where they could actually launch a real land attack, and so they're losing 4 morale for that, which is pretty big. That's a pretty big number. So, it doesn't pay to be too passive in this one. And then I have a final note here about strategic, I think that was supposed to be a C, not an X, strategic warfare with X as a variable. The reason why I'm putting that here is that, before we do production, where we're just sort of counting up our morale right now for our own sake, there is a case where there's strategic warfare that's going to occur basically after production and before morale happens. And it's going to happen over here because we have German subs with some convoys, the 8 CW convoys here. Because of that, there's going to be a strategic warfare role, and both Germany might act, Germany could end up losing this sub and taking some more morale losses, or we could lose some convoys, and that's going to have some morale losses because of the destroyed convoys. And if that's the case, then there's going to be some more morale loss from that, but it's going to occur after the production, so there's nothing more that we can do about it. Even if we're spending our maximum amount of build points on morale, these things that it could be 0, it could be, a couple. You've got some morale point loss here that we can't quantify yet because the die rolls haven't happened. So we can at least keep in mind that there's going to be another one. And that's why I have SW, Strategic Warfare TBD, in my notes. But minus 31 is pretty huge. I mean, you figure that's almost, that could be four losses. But obviously the Commonwealth's going to do what it can to address that. And then finally, the only other major power that we need to look at is France. Now, France has suffered some losses, not a huge amount actually. Their trouble is positioning. They're losing their positioning, but they haven't really lost that many units. They did lose this fort, which is worth a good bit for. And then it doesn't lose morale for the control of Brussels here? Somewhere is, Brussels. It does not count as a morale loss because the French didn't start the game in control of or having Belgium as a minor country. They only joined, or rather they took control because the Germans declared war on the Belgians, and they could have chosen not to do that, and then they wouldn't have been aligned. But because they did that, these units will contribute to France's morale loss. And then finally, the French actually did lose a home resource in eastern France, down here west of Metz. They lost this resource. So anytime an enemy controls your home territory resource or city, that's going to be a point. So the French also are losing quite a bit, and the calculation came out to be 21. So these are all fairly significant in terms of morale loss. It may not always be this high, but obviously with these opening weeks of the war and production point or offensive points being spent like crazy for big offensives, it's killing a lot of men. It's putting a lot of people in the graveyard, and so we've got a lot of morale hits because of the societies just responding to the havoc and the awfulness that is the Great War. So we have that in mind, and so we're going to look at the production, and again, it's good to know this because there's going to be a point where we want to spend some of our production for that home front production on the morale chart. The only real way in this game to gain morale, which is to spend production doing it, but the game does have some restrictions on you. So, a couple of things in the rules. There's a couple places in the rules that have some restrictions on what you can do with your production points. Firstly, those offensive points that we've been spending like crazy, those offensive points can be built, be increased again by building them in the build phase, but there is a stipulation in the rules, and this is in section 18.0 at the top of that section. Active major powers must spend at least 10% of each turn's production on offensive points, and that would be production that comes after lending and bonuses, but you can't include any saved build points in that calculation. Or else you're going to lose a tenth of a morale for each offensive point not purchased. For example, if your production is 4 build points, you don't have to buy any because 10% of 4 is 0.4. That rounds down to 0. But if your production was 15, you'd have to buy 2 because 15, 10% of 15 is 1.5. You round up to 2. Now, the reason this is in place, and when they say a tenth of morale, what they really mean is you're going to add another loss, like let's say you had to buy your 10% of each turn's production would be 2, but you chose not to build offensive points and instead built some other thing. You're going to lose morale as if you lost a corps here, or rather, this is a division. You would like as if France had lost this division again. You'd have a loss of 2. So, I'm not sure. I think the idea behind that is like, the whole country knows you need to be rebuilding ammunition and forces and everything else, so like you need to be building offensive points. But it's also maybe a thing because I think some people would forget to build offensive points because they're looking at their points and they're going, I'm going to buy this infantry unit, I'm going to buy some more planes, and they'd forget about offensive points, and the game really relies on offensive points for things to kind of happen in big ways, which is historically how the war really went. You'd have these the Brusilov offensive and the Kaiserschlacht and all these things. So you have to keep that in mind. So 10% of your production will go to buying offensive points. You should just do that almost all of the time because you really don't want to add anything else to morale losses. So you want O points, the offensive points, because you want to launch good offensives at some point, and you want to be building them because you don't want the unneeded morale penalties for not building them. So go ahead and build them. And that 10% is at least, so you could, if you wanted to, instead of building units, you could build lots and lots of O points, which at some point you may want to do because you don't want to be buying onesie, twosie little bits of offensive points, over time, and it's just taken so long. You might reach some point where you want to buy, a bunch, and offensive points take basically, you get 1 offensive point per build point that's not subject to gearing, which I'll talk about in another video, next video. And they take 2 turns to build. So any O points we build today are going to take until November, December to actually get. So I don't know. Keep that in mind. You're going to end up spacing it out. Don't build a bunch and then not build any for a while. It's better to have that slow trickle than a big gush of offensive points and then 0 because of that morale loss penalty. The other restriction that we kind of have to look at for spending is that, you might look and say, well, hey, if the Commonwealth is going to lose 31, has a penalty for morale of 31, why don't I just put all my points into morale? Well, the reality is the game stipulates upon you in the rules section 14.1 that there's a maximum amount you can have for home front spending. So if you want to check that 14.1, it's about, I don't know, a third of the way down from the header of 14.1. You can never spend more than 40% of each turn's production, meaning the stuff that includes lending, trading, and bonuses, but not any saved points from last turn, on purchasing morale, and you may never raise it above the starting 1914 level for the country, or raise it by more than 1 level each turn. So you can't just dump a country's full production into home front spending in a turn and just get all your morale back. You can't do that. You're restricted to that 40%. And that means you can spend less if you don't need it. If you're topped out on morale or you're happy with your morale level, you don't have to spend up to 40%. But I've kind of found that in almost every case in this game, because morale is so important, pretty much every country is going to want to be spending the maximum amount it can, that 40% every turn. Because if you get your morale dropping and it continues to drop, the game just gets harder and worse for you and you're in a death spiral. Now, things are made even worse by the fact that starting in 1915, some countries are going to start getting a war wariness penalty to morale anyway, and that will steadily increase through the years of the game. So just to reinforce that, the home front production can be used to, improve your morale. You can't improve morale by more than 1 level per turn, but even if you're lucky enough to be able to maintain your morale, eventually that war wariness is going to start to kick in. More units are going to be lost, and it's just, you're going to start to get worn down. That's just the reality of World War I. So keep that in mind. So if you want to think about it, if you're doing the minimum number of O points every turn and the maximum number of home front spending every turn, the sort of net effect of that is that half, 50% combined, half of your production are going to these things that are sort of musts, right? The O point, got to do the offensive point buying. You want to do the morale buying because you just need to do it so you don't suffer too many morale losses. So that's half your production right out of the gate on sort of these overhead things that you need to keep going, and that's going to leave the other 50% for actual unit production. So it's going to be kind of a tough decision here when we get to that part of the turn on how we're going to spend that production. So let's actually now shift gears a little bit. So we're about 29 minutes through the video. We're going to switch gears to do the actual production phase. So again, everything that we've done up to this point has been to calculate what our morale situation looks like for each country. Again, you're probably going to have a pretty good idea as you're writing down notes as the game goes on, but for my purposes, just getting it all here. And we'll do the production. So what I'm just going to try to do before the end of the video is run you through what every nation's production, how they're getting all of their production points, what are they going to spend on offensive points and morale, and then the final amount that they're going to have to build units with. And we'll cover what units they build and gearing limits and other stuff next video. That's probably all we'll have time for. So firstly, at the outset of the production phase, we have to do a quick little check here that yes, the Commonwealth has a surface naval vessel in the North Sea with American convoys. The Commonwealth, at this point, now that production is starting, is going to declare that the Commonwealth is enforcing the blockade, preventing the U.S. resources from reaching Germany. And so that would have meant that 2 resources were going to go to Germany. Now there will be none. And there will be a U.S. entry pool. So if you look at the chart for U.S. entry, there is a line item, number 26, Commonwealth seizes American trade. And it's going to be rolled once per turn, enforced or declared, and so it's going to be a -3. So basically, if we roll a die and it's 3 or less, we're going to take a chit out of the U.S. entry pool, which is going to be kind of bad for the Allies because it's going to slow down the U.S. entry. But again, that morale is probably worth it. So let's roll the die, and it's a 10. So the U.S. doesn't care, or they don't seem to care as much. It's not a big deal that's happened. So they're not going to lose any of their entry chits or anything like that. You know, these things that the Allies do that could take chits out of the entry pool, you got to keep in mind that, you know, there's some stuff that could leave, right? You could lose stuff out of the entry pool, but as stuff goes into the tension, nothing will take it out of the tension. And if you look at the U.S., its war chart, you know, eventually you're going to be able to enter the war with a high tension value, or as the tension value increases, you know, you need both the entry and the tension to increase. So, you know, that's the struggle. So anyway, so that was declared. Seizure of trade was declared and completed. And so let's now just in sort of a rough order look at doing production for Germany. Now, the first thing that you probably should do is check your charts, and this is on the same chart, same side of the charts as the weather chart. On the right-hand side, sort of lower right-hand side, there's 2 things we want to look at. One is the production multiples, and the other are the factories and resources chart. So the production multiples is something that changes over time in the game, and is basically a representation of the nations gearing up for war. And so what you should just do is, you know, depending on if you're playing solo or if you're playing one faction, just look up what your production multiple is, write it down for this turn. And since we're just going to start with Germany, we're going to look, so it's 1914. Germany, as well as Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans, have a production multiple base of 0.9. Now, I should just point out, you probably want to look down at, I think it says note B in the white box below the chart, but it's supposed to be A because it's note A because there's a B underneath it. But it says plus 0.1, while an in-supply enemy land unit is in your home country, not Siberia, and only UK counts for the Commonwealth. So, because we do have some Russians here in Prussia, in this home country that is Germany, then that 0.9 increases to 1. So the production multiple for Germany is 1. You say, okay, well, any number times 1 is itself. Yes, that's true, but if you look at the chart, you can see that over time you can get higher than 1, and many nations are going to have that lower than 1. So even if they count up all their resources, all their factories, and they get build points, they could end up with less than that you might think. And then the other thing is, so, you know, if you've been watching my videos, you may have seen my setup video, and I went through a really long process of setting up all the Commonwealth convoys to make sure that I can trace resources to factories and the whole thing. If you want to make it easier on yourself, my suggestion is to look at that factory and resources chart, and for each, you know, country or region, it tells you how many factories and how many resources are there. And what you can do is, so like in the case of Germany, we're going to be able to say, you know, if I look at the German part of that chart, it's going to tell me that in Germany there are 12 blue factories, 9 red factories, in total 21 factories. And for resources, there are 9 regular resources and 1 oil, so 10 resources. So I know, I don't, and I validated this. I've counted on the map to validate that there's not errata here. It is correct. If you look at, and I did it for every nation, so I spent a good, like, hour doing all these counts. If you look at Germany, and if I hide my units for a second, you could try to do a count and do da 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 da, and okay, are they all connected, and can I do the thing? It's much easier to look at that chart and then apply any logic on, is something different or has something changed? Like in the case of, we'll cover it in a minute. In France, they lost this resource. So, oh god, and I just moved some units by accident. That's great. Where are these guys? They're right here, I think. Okay, so let me hide these again. So, if France lost its resource, you would look at, the France part of the chart, and it says 11 factories, 7 resources. Well, if they lost a factory, and we know that because the Germans took it, then as the French player, I'm going to go, okay, well, I have only 6 resources now in the home country of France. So, in terms of the paperwork, that's really the best way to go about it, even though the Commonwealth is still going to be a pain in the butt, and we'll go through that here in a few minutes, but it's not too bad. So don't be afraid of all of these symbols on the map and tracing and everything else. It's really not too bad because you have that summary chart to kind of help you determine what's going on. The other thing that you want to look at is in the rulebook, towards the beginning of it, in section 5, the game lists out some trade deals, trade agreements that are in effect at the beginning of the game that you're going to want to take into account for calculation of production. And I should probably say, in case you didn't see my other videos or you're not sure how production works, the way production works, in a really high-level explanation, is you want resources and factories. And one resource plus one factory is a production point. So you can't just have factories. You got to have the things, the ore, the metals, the wood, the whatever, taken to the factories to be processed, right? So those are the resources. So one resource, one factory equals one production. You add up all of your possible production points that you have and that you have available to you. All the places where resources have been able to go to factories, and then you take that total lump sum of production points times your production multiple, and that tells you how many build points you actually have to spend. So, again, there's some logistics to this. There are ways to cut off resources and take stuff away from the enemy, but for the most part, it's not too bad. The calculations are pretty easy. So, let's look at the trade agreements for Germany. Going through, it looks like a neutral Bulgaria must supply Germany with one resource per turn. Well, Bulgaria is way over here. You might say, well, how is it going to get to Germany? We don't have convoys. Well, it's because the resource can travel by rail through neutral countries. So if we are saying it's this resource, technically now we could start tracing through our Austrian buddies through Serbia, but by default it would have been assumed that it was traveling by rail through neutral Romania, then into allied Austro-Hungary, before finally getting to Germany proper, where all of Germany's factories are. So neutral rail is just fine and dandy in terms of transportation. So that's how that would have occurred. Then Italy is going to supply Germany with one of its resources each turn. So Italy, is going to take one of its resources, whichever one, and it's got a simple rail path through the Alps to Germany. So that's one resource. The Netherlands are transporting 2 resources to Germany, one from the Netherlands itself, and the other from Dutch Guyana, with invisible convoys. Be careful of that special note in 5.1.4. That's how they're being transported. So that though there aren't convoys on here, you can't see them. They are sneaking over here somehow, because they're Netherlands convoys, and so they are coming through and getting Potentially, I guess they could be going into Rotterdam and then by rail to Germany. The game doesn't really list how that's happening, but anyway, Netherlands, 2 resources. Norway, a neutral Norway, must supply Germany with 1 resource, but the Germans got to give the convoy to do it, and sure enough, they actually do. So they have this one convoy in the Scandinavian coast that can go from. It doesn't really matter, but the resource will go to a port through the convoy to Kiel, and the Commonwealth did not send any ships in here to take them out. They were more focused on the North Sea, so the Germans got away with getting 1 resource from Norway. They're going to get a resource from Romania, which again is going to just trace through Austro-Hungary up to Germany for 1 resource. Now, Sweden would have given Germany 3 resources, and the Germans had the convoy set up in here to do it, but because of the naval combat and because the convoys were forced back to port, there are not the actual convoys that were able to deliver the resources, and so and those resources can't go across straits of neutral countries. They must have, for these resources, the Germans really needed to protect the Baltic, and they failed to do so. And so that is 3 resources that Germans are not going to get, which is actually pretty bad. They would have really liked to have those 3 resources. And then finally, you have those U.S. resources that were coming through the U.S. provided convoys. But again, it would have been 3. The U.S. restricted the trade down to 2. And then the Commonwealth seized the trade anyway, and so now the Germans don't get any of those resources. So, in terms of calculating what Germany has, that's a total of 6 resources by trade. Then you include the 10 resources from the home country. You also have the 21 factories in the home country. Also, the Germans have conquered, or will be conquering, Belgium. They control these hexes in Belgium. That includes, let's see, where is it? There it is. A resource here, and 2 factories that are red. Red factories mean that if you conquer them or take them, capture them, you can use them, assuming you can, they're part of your network of logistics. So, because the Germans have taken these 2 red factories, they can use them, and they can also use the 2 resources from Belgium in general. And so that means that the 2 resources and the 2 factories are going to get added to the big lump sum, the big pile of resources and factories for Germany. As well, they've got this French resource that they took and is connected by rail back to the home country. And so the calculation, which I'll just bring over in my notepad that I took track of, there is going to be a total of 19 resources that can go to the 23 available factories. Now, there's more factories than resources, which means our floor is the resources. So that means 19 production points times our production multiple of 1 is 19. We also get a bonus build point. Where does that bonus build point come from? It comes from the German core that was destroyed in home German territory that was attacked by the Russians, I think it was, and because an infantry corps unit that is destroyed in home territory provides a +1 bonus build point to that faction, and that sort of represents the fact that, yes, while that army group was rendered unable to continue combat, it may not totally be destroyed, and that it was able to save some of its munitions or equipment and men to be reconstituted and rebuilt later, and there's sort of a bonus to that. That's where the bonus build point comes from. So that provides Germany with 20 current turn build points. Now, if we looked at the 10% that is required for the offensive points, 10% of 20 is 2. That's the required amount. And the Germans are going to go ahead and spend the 2 so they don't get any extra morale losses. And what I'm going to do right now, just to represent that, is I'm going to take a set up anywhere chit because they're easy to clone in Vassal. And if you're playing this in a physical game, you just use some sort of scratch paper. You'd say GE2 0 points. And I'm going to put that on the turn track. Then next, we would look at what is the 40% of 40% that can be spent on morale for the home front, and 40% is 8, and the Germans are going to go ahead and spend the 8 points to cover as much of their morale loss as possible. They took a lot of hits, so they're going to want to try to mitigate that as much as possible, and so they're going to spend the full 8 to do that. And that's going to end up leaving them with 10 build points left for units. And if you just look at, some of these units right now that are flipped over, that number is the build cost. So just doing some math here, 10 points, that could be 3 infantry corps and 1 build point left over, or some permutation of other units. But you can see, in terms of what we're going to be building, we don't have a lot of change to spare in terms of building a lot of units. In fact, we probably are not going to be able to replace all the losses that we've already taken in this particular turn. Though in future turns, like in the winter where there's not a lot of fighting, more of the production can kind of go to refilling the lines and everything. But that's it for Germany. Germany's very easy. It's a land-based power, so tracing the resources and factories really is kind of straightforward. You're just looking at what areas are my trade agreements still able to supply, and what resources are coming from areas that I've taken. Put that together, and it's not very hard. So that much is done. We'll go ahead and move on to Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary's production multiplier for 1914 is 0.9. And they do have enemy units in home territory, namely the Russians again. So this is sort of a case where all those Russians invading kind of is going to help the Central Powers because they got to rally to the cause. So that means that Austria-Hungary's production multiplier for this turn is 1. They are getting 1 resource from the Italians via trade. It's their only real trade agreement they have. And that's being railed right on through here. Very easy. Let's see, in terms of their home country. So, if you look at the chart, Austria-Hungary has 8 factories, 6 resources. Well, one problem that we have is that one of those home resources has been taken by the Russians right here. And so, that's going to be 1 less, which means it has 5 available resources and 8 factories at home. It did capture a resource in Poland that sort of makes up for it, and it actually did take a resource down here in Serbia. I've got to find it in here somewhere. There it is. And so it's actually a little bit ahead of its starting position because it's managed to take a couple of resources, and this resource can be railed. It can't necessarily go through Belgrade because of the partisans, but it can go west to Sarajevo and then on through the rest of the network for these guys. So no big deal there. Okay, so that brings the grand total for Austria-Hungary. Bring it over here. 8 resources with 8 factories means 8 production points times 1 is 8. So 8 build points. The at least 10% for 0 points is 1, and the Austro-Hungarians are just going to spend the 1. So I'm going to clone this German one, and we're going to change the label to Austro-Hungarian 1 point. 2 turns from now. And then and this is actually going to be interesting. So up to 40% is actually 3. So, and there's some rounding involved in any of these when you get into the percentages, so be careful. But it would be 3 is the maximum. But if you remember that the Austro-Hungarians haven't actually lost that much morale, they're going to spend enough to likely offset any of the potential losses, but it's not likely to actually their morale is not going to actually go down. So they're going to spend 2 instead of 3. So again, cover some of the morale loss potential that's there, but not all of it. They're basically going to reduce the risk. They're going to gamble a little bit so they can keep an extra build point for units. So that leaves only 5 build points, much less, half that of Germany. Austria-Hungary is just not on the same level as Germany. 5 is just not as much, and that's the best that they're going to have to deal with. And that's it for the Central Powers. So, between the two of them, 15 build points of units to be built as we get into that phase. Not a lot, but, we'll see what happens. And again, Austria-Hungary being a land power, the sort of, way to trace all of their resources is pretty straightforward. It's all land-based, pretty much. Okay, so then we're going to start with the Allies, and I'm going to do them in sort of a weird order, in order of difficulty. So we'll do France first. Looking at France, France is a mostly land-based power, so this is going to be mostly easy. In terms of trade agreements, they're going to be getting 1 from Spain because they control Paris. And it's kind of a weird rule, so if the Germans ever control Paris, they would actually potentially be able to get that resource from Spain. They're also getting 1 resource via Algeria. This is really the only convoy I have set up, is that technically France controls Algeria. There is a resource in Algeria, and it's being railed to Oran or Algiers, whichever, and is being transported via this 1 blue French convoy point to the homeland for an extra resource there. In terms of the home country, France has the 7 resources normally with 11 factories, but again, because the Germans have taken one of those resources, they are left with 6 resources and the 11 factories. Had the Germans been able to take Lille, that would have been great and reduced their factories even more, though in this case it doesn't do a whole lot. So that leaves a grand total of 8 resources, 2 from trade, 6 from home country. That's the floor. Again, it's you can't empty factories don't do you any good. So 8 production points times their 0.9 multiplier. So their multiplier was 8 plus 1 because Germans are in France is 9, so times 9, and this actually becomes 7, dealing with any rounding there. And then they did get a bonus build point from earlier, and I put a little asterisk on my chart because there might have been some cases where the French maybe could have gotten more bonus build points, and I forgot to track it. So I guess just as a, I could rewatch all of my videos and try to keep track, but at this point I'm too far past the point. So keep an eye on it. You should think about, if you're playing, especially if you're playing with an opponent, to really try to remember, like if you're being attacked, you want that build point, and your opponent's not going to keep track for you, so you're going to want to try to remember, hey, I lost this unit here, I'm going to mark down that bonus build point. So if indeed it is just the 1 build point, the 1 bonus build point that I tracked properly, that would leave us with 8 production points for France. That 10% requirement is going to end up being 1, and the French are going to go ahead and do the 1. So I'm going to clone, change label. This is a France 1.0 point. And then in terms of morale, their 40% limit is 3, and France is going to go ahead and do the maximum because they did take sufficient enough losses here that, again, they want to try to mitigate as much as possible. And then that's only going to leave them with 4 points left, which is very little. And if you figure, 4 is only worth, some divisions or maybe 1 corps, and you might think, oh no, France is in really big trouble. Well, The reality is they have a bunch of reinforcements that are about to come in. So, it's not necessarily that dire for France. They've got units on their way. Okay, so 4 points done. Now we would move on to Russia. So Russia's production multiplier for 1914 is only 7. They don't have any enemy units in home territory, so they don't get any bonus. Finland. They do control still. So Finland is right now a sort of conquered minor country. They do have a resource in Petsamo. I can't read that well. And that is traveling all the way on through. At least right now it is. So traveling on through. So that's one resource. In Poland, and this is the only other minor country that we can really look at. If you look at the chart for Poland, it says 2 factories, 1 resource. So there's a factory here. There's a factory there, all still held by the Russians. And they're actually missing the resource because the Austro-Hungarians took it. So they're just getting factory use of these red factories from Poland, but they're getting the 1 resource from Finland. Their home country, and right now, because there's no need to cut it in half, the chart has a couple different entries for Russia. There's a European Russia, there's a Siberia, and then those two combined give you the Russia, and then in parentheses it says as in total Russia count. So just look at the Russia count. It's got 28 resources, 26 factories, which is pretty significant. And it did capture a resource from Austria, so the calculations that gives us, I'll get back on screen for you here, is total count there, 30 resources, 28 factories. Our floor is actually the factories now instead of the resources. We have an abundance of resources, but not enough industrialization for the Russians. Gives them 28 production points, times the 0.7 is 19.6, rounded up to 20. It's just that easy, guys. Very easy. So current turn buildings is 20. That's the same as Germany, so you can imagine at least 10% on O points, and the Russians are going to go ahead and do that. So we'll make a clone of the German marker here. Now there are counters in the game that have, that are meant to be O points. You can see 5 offensives, but you can't get them, like the counters are only in denominations of like 5 and 10. But you can build 1. So to me, it's like, you kind of need another counter to represent that, and there really isn't a good one. So I'm going to change that label to gross. Okay. So they built their O points of only 2, and then they're going to spend the max on morale up to 40%, which is 8. So they're going to spend the 8 for that, and that's going to leave them with 10 build points for units, which is the same as Germany, interestingly enough. So they're going to get 10. So they could get some core back, or get some core in general. The Russians, have a pretty hefty force pool, so they can just build a bunch more units. That's probably what they're going to end up doing. They're a land power, so again, production for the most part is pretty easy to track for Russia. Then we're going to go into, this is going to be sort of an interesting switch, to the USA. I'm going to save the Commonwealth for last, just because they're a little more complicated. And so the United States has a lot of constraints on it for production because of the special rules with them entering the war. And I have actually created a PDF document that's available on BoardGameGeek that's been up for a while, which is a US build progression guide. And it just assumes that you're going to get, you're going to take the options in the order that is progressive, that is one by one, that all these events are going to happen in the right order, and tell you exactly what you can build as the United States player at any given point in the game. I did this because in the rules, You wouldn't know that you can only build naval units in 1914 until you read the part of the rules that told you that you could then do it. It's very easy to miss, right? You just say, "Oh, I'm the United States. I'm going to build a bunch of stuff." Well, no, you're limited, and you wouldn't know it until you got to that section of the rules as a learner. So instead, follow. You can still read the rules is fine, but I've put this together as a way to kind of follow along, and so it escalates from here. At game start 1914, the United States may only build naval units, but they can't build amphibious naval units, AMPs. They cannot save build points, and they cannot build offensive points, and their production multiplier is a measly 2. Later, as options are taken, that the United States can then start building United States. I missed an S on there. Terrible. I'm not in edit mode. Anyway, the United States may build naval units and 1 air unit or 1 land unit per turn, and then it slowly starts to ramp up from there, where you have basically no restriction after a while, and so the U.S. production is going to be a really simple exercise. So firstly, the trade agreements for the United States, they're getting one from Cuba, which they did give, it's hidden under here, 1 convoy point going from Cuba to, we'll say, New Orleans and on through. Let me get back to my notes here. Then it's sending 2 resources to Germany, which that was set up at the beginning of the turn, so even though the resources never got to Germany because they were seized by the Commonwealth, the United States did give them up. So we take that as a minus to our overall resource score. So looking at the chart for the United States, it's 30 resources, 30 factories. It's a net -1 to resources from external. So that brings us down basically to 29 resources with 30 factories. The floor is 29 times 0.2. 5.8 rounds up to 6. We can't build O points, so nothing there to record, and they're not going to lose morale or anything because they're neutral. No morale change. Nothing to spend on. And so they have build points left for units to 6. Again, they're only going to be able to build naval units. So if you look at the force pool for the Americans, it's going to be probably a couple of service naval vessels. And that's probably going to be it. Maybe some transports, something like that, to that effect. It's going to be really simple for the United States' builds for a while. Okay, so United States is done. Now we finally get to the Commonwealth. Now, again, this takes a little bit of logistical working. And the nice thing is, I've done all of that ahead of time for the video purposes, but as a reminder, if you're going to play with a bunch of folks, if you don't want to be worrying about, sea lanes and all these convoy chains and this broad network of supply and, transport efficiency and everything, you may not want to play the Commonwealth. Maybe let a more experienced player play the Commonwealth, but there's a lot going on. Particularly with setup and then retaining the pipelines you've set up as part of setup to continue to get points in your resources and factories and everything else. So, let's see here. The Commonwealth production multiple is 0.6 for 1914. In terms of trade agreements, they are getting a resource from Persia, but I didn't actually set the convoy up for it. So if we look on the world map, Persia is right here. It has 1 oil resource. I did not set up the convoy to pick it up in the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is empty. So the Commonwealth isn't getting that resources from convoys, this convoy chain that starts here and flows through Egypt. Technically, this resource could go via some rail connections, but wherever it goes, I still don't have the convoys set up for it. So you could trace from Bandar Shapur through Tehran, through Tabriz onto 15 and 19 hexes. So you navigate over to there. So 15 through 19 means we could trace through now into Russia, because Russia's a pal. And you could trace all the way through various, you know, railway hexes in Russia. If you tried to go north, you'd probably end up on the Baltic and there's no convoy, or you would run it all the way through the Scandinavian countries, in which case there's still no convoy set up for it. And then finally you could trace it all the way down through some neutral countries into, you know, maybe Greece, or Bulgaria, but I still don't have any convoys set up specific for this resource. So the one Persian resource that is available, we don't get. Venezuela is providing 2 resources, but we did set up the convoys for that. So there's 2 going from British Guyana for these 2 resources. Then there's buried underneath, here it is. There's 4 in the Caribbean that are picking up from the 2 convoys here, plus the 2 coming from Venezuela. And then this pipeline of convoys goes from here to here to here, and then on through Pharaoh's Gap to Glasgow for the factory use. We talked about the British Guyana. The Malaysian resources are being transported via convoys, so the convoy chain starts here in the Bay of Bengal, where it's adjacent to Singapore, so 2 resources. Then join up with resources from India, which we'll talk about in a second, to be in the Arabian Sea for 5, and then this chain basically just flows through the Mediterranean Sea. And again, if you weren't watching my setup video, wherever you're transporting your resources, even build points, if you're doing a trade agreement with Lend-Lease, have to go through sea zones of, you know, if you have to use sea zones and not a land route, have to be, you know, the pipe has to be wide enough each leg of the journey. And so each sea zone is a leg of that journey, and the number of convoys is the width of your pipe, if you want to think about it like that, like a pipeline. So those 5 from the, you know, again, 2, these 2 resources, picking up 3 in India for 5, into the Red Sea for 5, into Eastern Mediterranean for 5. Technically, there's also a resource in Cyprus, but again, I did not set up convoys for it. I wanted to keep some convoys in reserve to replace losses. So that 5 goes into 5, goes into 5 underneath here, and then it joins up with some other convoys to be 7, and then we get into 7, and then we're able to trace up into Plymouth for the resources. And then finally, there's potentially had been a resource in Rhodesia in Africa, but again, the Germans took that. The Germans can't really make use of that resource themselves. They can't get it anywhere, so it's effectively not useful. But the Commonwealth sure as heck can't use it because it's captured. Then finally, because there's a lot of home countries in the Commonwealth, it's even more complicated. So, if we look at Australia, Australia on the chart and on the map has 1 factory and 3 resources. And what that basically means, if I get the right notes up, is that they can by themselves produce 1 production point. You know, 1 of the 3 resources can go to an Australian factory, and that just gets, I don't know, magically aggregated into the larger pile of production points for 1, and then there are 2 resources left over, but they're not getting to Britain because there are no convoys set up for them. Yeah, I didn't set up any convoys for them. So we're not getting them. you're going to see that we don't need them, and that's why I didn't bother creating the chain for it. Um, Next, we would look at India. India has 4 resources, 1 factory, so again, by itself, 1 production point. And then it has 4 potential resources, or I'm sorry, that's supposed to be 3. 3 potential resources are going to be going to Britain, and all 3 of them are going to Britain. So you can see, in terms of our chain, the 2 from Malaysia, again, adding up with the 3 that are coming through Bombay, makes this 5 convoy points on through to getting to Britain. Then we have South Africa, which right now there's 1 resource here on this map, and then all the way down here there's another resource in South Africa. So that's 2. And those 2 are getting to Britain because we have a leg or a branch of our supply chain going from South Africa to Cape Basin. So that's 2 convoy points, 2 convoy points, 2 convoy points in here, and then forget exactly why I have 1 convoy down here. Why did I do that? Oh, it's because I'm missing a resource for France. I'll have to go make some adjustments. We'll circle back around in a second. So, okay. So then the 2, and then the 7, and so on to get back to Britain. So then in Canada, there's 6 resources, 2 factories, so it can do 2 production points by itself. It is sending 4 to Britain. It has the convoys for that. And then the United Kingdom itself, or what I had been referring to as Britain, but the United Kingdom itself has only 2 resources, but 17 factories. That means it can do 2 production points by itself with local resources, but it's got the 15 factories that require imported resources to get 15 more production. Well, if you do the count, and I did do the count, I am bringing in 15 resources to Britain. And you can see the final legs of the journey here. 8 convoys in the Faroes Gap, and then there was the 7 in the Bay of Biscay. That's the 15 coming into Britain. So they get, they're basically, even though I'm not transporting all possible resources everywhere, I have enough convoys to get to all of my factories that I have. And so I'm essentially getting the maximum number of production points that I can get at this point, which is 21 production points times the 0.6 production multiple is 12.6, rounds up to 13. Then it's a question of what's the O points? Well, it basically rounds down to 1, and they're going to go ahead and do the 1. And so we will clone, change label, we'll say CW10 point. In terms of morale, the Commonwealth has gotten hurt the most from morale. They've got a really heavy-duty loss, but again, because they can only spend up to 40%, that maximum is 5, and they are spending the 5. So they're spending 6 on these things. It's going to leave them with 7 build points to build units with, which is not very much, especially when you consider the fact that they're going to want to rebuild that HQ unit, and that's 5 by itself. So, I think there's going to be some tough choices for the British to make in terms of what do they want to start building with their small number of points. And they're always going to kind of feel that way until they can get their production multiplier up. So that's going to be a challenge for them. And it looks like I need to go back. We're going to turn back time a little bit and look at France. So it turns out that we were shipping, and I completely forgot because it's over here in the lower left corner of the map where I never look, but there is a resource in Senegal that we are transporting. So let me make a note here. Senegal, 1 resource. So what does that change our numbers a little bit? I think it might, right? So that means our production floor was 9 production points. So 9 times 0.9 is actually 8, or rounds to 8 basically, which means our current turn build points is 9. Because of the bonus, we need to spend, let's see, I'm going to guess this doesn't change, so 9 times 0.1 rounds up to 1, yeah, and then 9 times 0.4, they could actually spend, that rounds up to 4, so they actually could spend 4, and I think they're going to go ahead and do that. Now, that still means that they're only going to have 4 build points for units, but this is another chunk of coverage for morale purposes, and I feel like that's a nice little boon for them. I mean, they've got a fair bit, and so this is going to help mitigate those losses. So don't forget about Senegal, everybody. It's right here, right off the edge of the map. But that's a whole resource that can make a pretty big difference for the French production. All right, what are we doing for time here? Okay, hour and 16 minutes. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to hit save on all of these documents so that I don't lose track of what we've done. I would hate for that to happen at this point. Okay, so what have we done? We've calculated our, preliminary morale values. We very quickly calculated what our production is for each country, what the O point expenditure is going to be, what we're going to spend on morale, which will factor into the morale phase, which comes, soon. And we know how much points we have left, or we've chosen to have left, to actually build units for each country. In the next video, we're going to go through, and for each country, we're actually going to spend our morale. So for each country, we'll pick what units we're going to build. We're going to put them on the production circle to actually build them, or start building them. We'll also do strategic warfare in the one case where strategic warfare is possible. We'll then have to apply the results of that to whatever morale tracking we have, so we'll need to keep that in mind. And that will be added to the totals. And then we ought to be able to apply the morale losses based on what we get. So we'll run through all of that. That may be all we'll have time for in the next video, but I think that's what I currently have. So my look ahead for video is, you can see my notes. I'm just going to share my notes, guys. It's fine. What units to build, strategic warfare in the Atlantic, implement morale hits. We might talk about subversion, which is technically a political action, but it occurs during the morale phase, so we'll talk to that in the next video likely, and then in the next video we'll work through what is going to be the rest of the major items you would do in a turn. The peace phase dealing with conquests, a quick victory check, and then the rest of the political actions. Essentially, how do we influence these minor countries on the political chart? Yeah, the diplomacy aspect of getting these minor countries engaged in the war. So we will get into that in the next couple of videos. Yeah, I think we're good. So, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. If you stuck through all the other videos, you made it this far. We're getting close to the end of the series. When we get to the end of these sort of next couple of videos, I'll probably do a few add-on videos to do some demonstrations of stuff that we didn't get to do, like strategic bombing, air combat, a few things that are sort of, restricted to the later parts of the war that we wouldn't see here in 1914. I want to make sure to do some demonstration of that so you guys get a chance to see what that looks like. So those will be coming as well. Again, I think I've said this before, the game doesn't necessarily take this long to play. Again, I'm taking a long time explaining what I'm doing rather than just playing. I'm having to make all the decisions for every single country on both sides. And then in addition to that, just as sort of a broader warning, the first turn of this game takes longer than probably any other turn because everything has to sort of be done in phases. You start getting engaged with each set of units, then they start fighting. You have a lot of offensive points. You're doing a lot of, a lot more attacks that are going to have good odds of victory than you would do, maybe normally, especially in winter turns. So you won't always get to attack this much because you can't double your combat factors as often. And then in addition to that, there's sort of like all this, initial paperwork I did to get sort of the production and morale stuff figured out. Well, once you've done this for the first turn, when it comes to the second turn, it's really easy. You just look at, well, what's changed? Is it still 1914? Yes, then my production multiple doesn't change. Have I lost any resources? No, so I don't decrease. Did I gain anything? Maybe. And so you just adjust the numbers just a little tiny bit each turn because not a lot changes from turn to turn. So that first time you do all this production and calculation, it lasts you a while through the game because not a whole lot is all changing at once. It's very incremental. And if you're using a spreadsheet, that's great. If you're using scratch paper, that's great. You can just look back at previous turns and kind of go from there in terms of what the current state of the game is. So not really that big of a deal. So don't be scared by the length of all these videos and everything else. It's a good game, and it'll play faster, especially when you get used to the rules. So yeah, all good stuff. So again, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're one of the subscribers, thanks for sticking with. If you like this video, hit the like button, hit subscribe if you want to see more. I will be doing other games besides Fatal Alliances and World in Flames in the future. I've got some stuff planned to come, so check all of that out. Catch you later. Take care.